Hello again. So now we're off to the next lesson under the Green Laws module. Okay, so this is lesson 2, and in this lesson we're going to focus on one law. That law is specifically on wildlife conservation and protection. Okay, so it's the Wildlife Conservation Act, but more specifically, it is the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. That's the title, the short title actually, of the law. And it's also commonly referred to as Republic Act, or RA number 9147. Okay? So, like the other laws, in order to make this as targeted or as relevant as possible to the objective of this course, we're not going to be looking at every minute detail of the law. Hindi natin hihimay-himayin, okay? It may end up being boring. It's going to take a lot of time. Not to mention, there are things that may not necessarily be relevant to your immediate objectives. Since this is, parang ito na yung pinaka-baseline in your steps towards, the opportunity in environmental law enforcement. So this is the baseline. So we're going to make sure that we stay within that framework. Okay. So with that said, there's 3 areas that we're going to look at. These are the salient, rudimentary areas of this law, this Wildlife Conservation Act, Wildlife Resource Conservation and Protection Act. Okay? The first area aims to help us understand what this law is about. Okay? What is the rationale behind it? Okay? What does it aim to achieve? Okay? That's the first of the 3 areas that we're going to focus on. The second is organization. In earlier laws, I've talked a lot about the entities, the organizations that are mandated to implement the provisions of the law. But I do want to remind that when we're talking about this second part, which I call organization, that we're not really limited to the entities that are mandated to deliver on the objectives of the law, but also the act of organizing by the government in order to deliver on those objectives. Okay, so we'll look to the provisions of law that we'll discuss that. And the third and last area is probably the most relevant to this course, perhaps even the most interesting, and it's on an area that we're calling sanctions. Okay, and basically that's where we will look at the penal provisions, the criminal offenses that are enumerated on this law, and we'll analyze it because as an investigator there is a need to determine what are the elements of an offense or a provision of law to make it so it is an actual crime as defined in that law. Okay, so this area, this third section, will give us the opportunity to not only look at all of the provisions that criminalizes some act under this law, but will also give us the definition of the offense, just the same the penalty that is provided therefore. Okay, so it's a special penal law, so it defines crimes and provides for its penalties. So that's where we're going to focus our third area on. So having said that, let me move forward and get started with the rationale. Again, the reason behind this first section is to understand or get an answer as to what this law is about. Okay, so as in earlier laws, we said that this question is answered typically in the first part of the law. We find it in the whereas clause, in the declaration of policy, and sometimes even the law title itself will give us the answer. And sure enough, that is the case here. Okay, This law, RA 9147, or the Wildlife Conservation and Protection Act, okay, um, also does not have the whereas clauses, which is very common in many laws, but in this case, it doesn't have whereas clauses. But it does provide a very descriptive title. It's concise yet descriptive, and essentially already gives us the purpose of the law. What is this law about? And it does, pretty much tell us that it is one that provides for the conservation and protection of not only the wildlife resources but also their habitats. So that title, or at least the section that I highlighted on the title, is pretty much it. It tells us exactly what this law is all about. What is missing, and which is commonly answered in whereas clauses, is really the real rationale behind why there is a need to provide for the conservation and protection. Okay. Um, Again, there is no whereas clauses on this law that would give us that. So we look at other areas. In this case, we can look at the declaration of policy, and this one doesn't have that basis, but it does, given its purpose of declaring a state policy. It does give us as a policy and also as a basis as to why there's a need to provide for the conservation and protection of wildlife and their habitats. Okay, the declaration goes that it is the policy of the state to conserve the country's wildlife resources and their habitats. Okay, that's kind of it's not mentioned here, but it's typically the declaration of policy is in line with another law or the Constitution, and that's likely the case here. Okay, so yes, it may not have given us the real rationale as to why there's a need, but at least we have a kind of an idea of what it's attempting to do or to achieve, and it also gives us a basis based on the state policy. Okay, and I think for the most part, the real basis medyo may pagka-obvious din yan considering the resources, the wildlife resources that exist in the Philippines. Many are endangered, and some even only in existence not just in this region, and some even just in the Philippines. So there's a need to conserve and more importantly protect those endangered species, or all wildlife resources for that matter, including their habitats. Okay, so in terms of exactly from just to summarize what this law is all about. It's really all about the wildlife resources and their habitats. Okay, most notably, the necessary activities of the government that is going to be required by this law towards conserving and protecting the same. Again, the conservation and protection does not apply alone to wildlife resources. It also applies to their habitats. All right, so now that we're done discussing the rationale on what this law is all about, we are now in a position to go ahead and shift to the question of how this law provides. So we'll look at the organization, or at least not just the entities, but also the means by which the law provides for the delivery of the objectives of this law. Okay, so let's first look at Section 4 of this law. Section 4 talks about jurisdiction because I think it's important that we discuss that because this law, at least the area that this law covers, which is wildlife resources and their habitats, actually involves not just the DNR, but also the Department of Agriculture, most notably its Bureau on Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, or BFAR. Okay, so they cover essentially all of the wildlife resources in the water and most everything else is with the DNR. Okay, so this section pretty much defines or provides clarity as to where the divide lies. Okay, let's go ahead and read it. It's again referring to the jurisdiction of the DNR and the DA. Okay, the DNR shall have jurisdiction over all terrestrial plant and animal species. The terrestrial, of course, we're talking about on land. Okay, terrestrial plant and animal species, all turtles and tortoises and wetland species, including but not limited to crocodiles, water birds, and all amphibians and dugong. The Department of Agriculture shall have jurisdiction over all declared aquatic critical habitats, all aquatic resources, including but not limited to all fishes, aquatic plants, invertebrates, and all marine mammals except dugong. The secretaries of the DNR and the DA should review and by joint administrative order revise and regularly update the list of species under their respective jurisdiction. So this sort of clarifies that the aquatic resources are clearly that of DA, and of course the terrestrial species, animal species, are that belonging to the jurisdiction of the DNR. But there are some species that are sort of in between, diba? The reptilians. So this section of the law provides some clarity as to who has jurisdiction over them. Okay. There is also an important mention here. This is on the last part of this section, and it refers to a council that we earlier discussed or brought up in our earlier lessons. And this is referring to the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development, which was created pursuant to Republic Act number 7611. That same law that created it also defined its mandates, the scope of its authority and jurisdiction. And it's mentioned here because it discusses, since there's a discussion here on jurisdiction. So besides DNR and DA, the Palawan Council also has some jurisdiction in this space, and it pertains to anything in the province of Palawan, which again the Palawan Council has jurisdiction on, based on the mandates given it, the mandates and the powers given to it by Republic Act number 7610. Okay. Moving forward, there's another worthwhile mention that I should raise here, and it's under Section 3 of the same law. And this one really talks about the extent of the application of this law, or the scope. Okay. Again, this law is about the wildlife resources and their habitats, namely the conservation and protection of. So what is the extent of that conservation and protection of those wildlife resources and their habitats? That's what Section 3 essentially provides. Okay, it says that the provision of this act, the Wildlife Conservation Act, shall be enforceable for all wildlife species found in all areas of the country, that's in the Philippines, including protected areas under Republic Act 7586, otherwise known as the NIPAS Act, or the National Integrated Protected Area Systems Act, a law that we'll be covering in later lessons under green laws. Okay? So it provides essentially, or it includes the scope, includes those that are under the NIPAS Act. Okay, as well as the critical areas, and it also talks about exotic species that apply. Okay, under this under the scope of this law. Okay, it goes to say that this act shall also apply to exotic species which are subject to trade, are cultured, maintained or bred in captivity or propagated in the country. So pretty much yung mga nangyayari dyan sa what is that area in Pasay City where they sell a lot of exotic wildlife. Anyway, I think I know Cardamar, yun, Cardamar. Uh, so all of the species that are sold there, okay, the exotic species, fall within the scope of this law. Okay. Now, this law also provides measures, regulatory measures, or provisions that enable, or at least allows for, or provides for limited allowance for particular activities. Okay, so these activities fall under the category of the law called conservation and protection of wildlife resources, and these essentially are provisions that are part of how the law is able to deliver on its promise, or rather on its objectives. Okay, so let's see what these activities are, which the law provides for limited or controlled allowance. Okay, let's start with the first one: collection of wildlife. The next one is possession of wildlife. Now, before we move on with the rest of the enumeration, I think it's worthwhile to just stitch back and define what exactly is wildlife. I think that's a word that we sort of take for granted, thinking that we know it. And when we're talking about wildlife, hindi ito yung mabangis na aso ng kapitbahay. Okay, a dog is by nature one that can be domesticated. So regardless of its behavior, however mabangis it might be, it does not make it a wildlife. A wildlife is referring to wild forms and varieties of flora and fauna. So we're talking about wild forms of not just animals, wildlife, but we're also talking about plants, okay, flora and fauna. Okay, so it also refers to these wild forms, regardless of where in their development stages they might be. So in other words, it's wild forms of and varieties of these flora and fauna in all development stages. Okay, whether they're in captivity or being bred or propagated. Okay, so just because they've been taken and are in captivity, nakakulong sila, it doesn't mean that they could be domesticated. I think they're again, by their very nature, they're wild animals. So even if they're in captivity, they remain wild animals and thus fall under the category or the definition of wildlife. Okay, so they fall within the scope of this law. All right, so let's move on with the rest of the enumeration. Collection and or possession of byproducts and derivatives. Okay, byproducts and derivatives really are yung mga nanggagaling sa wildlife. Okay, so yung mga body parts, probably that's a good way to describe. There are clearly some that are totally illegal. For example, yung mga ivory tusks of African elephants, some of the shells of endangered tortoises here in this region. Clearly, those are, because of their very nature of being endangered, the possession and collection of those byproducts are unlawful. They're illegal. Okay, but there are some byproducts and derivatives that may be allowed. Okay, one thing I'm thinking of, probably not very many in the Philippines, pero in the States, yung mga mahilig mag-hunting, they tend to hang their trophies in their trophy room or in their home office, and those trophies usually are like the heads of the deers that they hunt with their very long horns, mga ganyan. So those are byproducts or derivatives of wildlife. Okay, a deer is wildlife, so essentially the trophy, of that, the head of that deer that's hanging on the wall of some hunter. That's precisely an example of a byproduct or a derivative of wildlife. Okay, moving on to the enumeration. Local transport of not only wildlife but the byproducts and derivatives. Okay, again, this is local transport, so that's movement of these things, of the wildlife and the byproducts, in different places within the country. So that's local transport. Okay, and then there's also international transport, which is referred to here as exportation and or importation. Exportation, of course, is when you're sending something out of the country, out of the Philippines, into destined for another country. And importation is the opposite direction, where you're bringing in species of wildlife from different countries into the Philippines. Okay, moving on. The introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of endemic or indigenous wildlife. When we say endemic, we're talking about native or species, wildlife species that are native to a particular location, region. Like the tarsier, okay, they're native to parts of Visayas, so they're endemic in that area. So this one, it talks about the introduction and reintroduction or restocking. So that's usually in cases where syempre medyo mababa na yung population of that particular endemic species, and you wanna make sure that they don't become extinct. So there is a provision in law that provides for a way to do that, to introduce, reintroduce, and restock. Okay, moving on. Introduction of exotic wildlife. Okay, self-explanatory. Bioprospecting. Okay, bioprospecting, that's an interesting concept. Okay, kasi what it really is talking about is research, collection, and utilization. And this research, collection, and utilization is of biological and genetic resources, and the purpose really is to apply the knowledge derived from this research for the sole purpose of commercial use. It's solely for commercial purposes. Okay, so that's bioprospecting. Okay, next, scientific researches on wildlife. That's also self-explanatory. The law has some provisions for that. Provisions for controlled allowance, okay, of that activity. Biosafety. Okay, this is also another interesting area, interesting activity. Okay, this is really referring to the activities that deals with genetic engineering and even pathogenic organisms in the Philippines. So kind of an interesting area, since that's kind of the reason why we are in this pandemic or this COVID-19 outbreak today. There is some genetic or pathogenic organism experimentation apparently in Wuhan, right? So anyway, going back to biosafety, that's really what biosafety is referring to. It's referring to activities that looks to deal with, or at least that deals with genetic engineering, including pathogenic organisms. Okay, so that's biosafety. Next, commercial breeding or propagation of wildlife resources. Commercial breeding, so it's like you have yung mga aso na may lahi, where you breed them and you sell them off. So that's essentially what we're talking about here. But rather than domesticated animals, we're referring to wildlife resources. You breed them and you propagate or sell them off. Okay, so the law provides some controlled allowances for that. All right. So next, there is also within this law a section that discusses protection of threatened species. Okay, there are 4 specific provisions. And they cover essentially anything that deals with the protection of threatened species. So, for example, a system for determining, these threatened species, some allowances for the collection of these threatened wildlife, including the byproducts and their derivatives, as well the conservation, breeding, or propagation of threatened species, and an important point of mention is the establishment of critical habitats. Habitats, as we know, are basically yung mga tirahan ng mga in this case the threatened species. They're critical, of course, because the species are critical. Kung mawalan sila ng tirahan, maging homeless sila, then they're even at greater risk of dying off or becoming extinct. Okay. Lastly, in this area of organization, okay, the provisions of this law that really discusses how this law provides according to its objectives. Okay, is it talks of essentially a kind of a database that is intended to gather all of the persons who are in possession of threatened and exotic species. So it's a registration system. So anybody who is in possession of any threatened and exotic species, there is a mandate for them to register. But the law, and we'll talk about the prohibited acts in a little while. But essentially, it's unlawful, save for exceptional cases. But it's unlawful. It could be unlawful to be, actually it would be unlawful to be in possession of threatened and exotic species that are unregistered. So this concludes the discussion on the second part of the law, the area we're referring to as organization. So we now move to the section that is probably most interesting, considering that it is the most relevant section to the objective of this course. And we're referring to the third area that I'm calling as sanctions. And this is the area where we are answering the questions of what acts are punishable under this law. Okay. So let's go ahead and begin to take a look at what the illegal acts are as defined in this law. Okay. There are actually a number of them, but let's start with the first part, which essentially makes a general statement. Let's just go ahead and display it. Okay, it says here that unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this law or this act, it shall be unlawful for any person to willfully and knowingly exploit wildlife resources and their habitats. Or, okay, so but before we go to the next part, there's actually two alternatives to this one. This being the first, and then there's another one that we'll go over in a minute. I think it's worthwhile to discuss this first. Okay, so in reading this entire sentence, what it's saying really is that in general, it's unlawful for any person to do this willful exploitation of wildlife resources and their habitats. Okay, so that's the general rule. Okay, generally, that's unlawful. It's criminal to do that. Okay, so there is an exception. Okay, the exception is what is stated in the beginning of the sentence, that being unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this act. Okay, so basically what it is saying here is that it's giving the general rule that, again, this is criminal. It's unlawful to exploit wildlife resources and their habitats. However, it may be lawful, okay, if it is provided, if it is allowed, there's some controlled allowance in this law. Okay, remember kanina I used a couple of times the phrase controlled allowance. Okay, when we were talking about the organization, I enumerated what was included in the law as a means to pretty much deliver on the objectives of the law. Okay, and I mentioned that there are some activities, and these just these are things that we just talked about moments ago. Okay, and I talked about particular activities which, if you were just to kind of see them, they appear to be unlawful, but this law, at least in those sections that we just discussed, has some provisions that make it so it's allowed in a controlled way. Okay, so anyway, if there are things there that fall within those controlled allowable activities that are also here on this illegal acts, in this area of the law that defines illegal acts. Okay, since they're in both, in this section that talks about illegal acts, says that generally they're criminal unless it is somewhere in this law that says it's not illegal. Since that's essentially what it's saying here, then as an exception, it would not be unlawful, it would not be criminal. Okay, but this first section here, this first option here, this willfully and knowingly exploit wildlife resources and their habitats, medyo sweeping to it. It's not really specific. It just says, when we're talking about exploit, it's really, in its most simple term, it's really saying using. Okay, so you could read it this way: it's willfully and knowingly using wildlife resources and their habitats. Okay, so what is interesting to note here is this using or exploiting wildlife resources and their habitats is qualified by the phrase willfully and knowingly. Okay, so in other words, okay, a person who you catch, let's say you're an investigator, you catch him in the act of actually using wildlife resources and their habitats. Okay, you catch him in the act. Okay, you can't immediately conclude. It's not conclusive that he committed a crime. Kasi the one thing you're gonna need to determine is whether he did that willfully or knowingly. Medyo mahirap yan. Okay, but anyway, this is added in this phrase, so that's an essential element, to qualify this as a crime, to qualify the exploitation of wildlife resources and their habitats as a crime. Okay, there has to be some willfulness, and that the person that did it also did it knowingly. Okay, so it's important that those two prefaces, those two qualifiers are there. Okay, all right. So I think that should make sense. Let's move on. So that's the first part. Okay, the second, which follows after or, is this phrase: the undertake that it's unlawful for any person to undertake the following acts. So there's an enumeration of what those acts are. Let's go ahead and list them. Okay. You will notice as I go along that there are some familiar phrases here. Okay, like the last one, transporting of wildlife. Okay, that act is here. Okay, it's saying this provision of law says that it is illegal to transport wildlife as a general rule. But if you will remember when we were talking about the controllable allowances, transporting of wildlife was there. That you could transport locally. You do local transport of wildlife, byproducts, and derivatives. And you could also do international transport, which was described as exportation as well as importation of wildlife. Okay. Yet here on this area or this section of the law, it says that it's illegal. Okay. But because it is on that other section that says in certain cases it's allowed, then that is what prevails, because that is the exception. Okay. So you as an investigator, you're gonna have to do those cross-referencing. So medyo iba dito. It's not like the first two laws that we looked at, even if there were some slight differences in how they were defined and penalized, or at least the way they structured their sentences, it was still relatively easy to find the elements of the offense. Okay, here, in a way, medyo easy pa rin, pero iba siya. It requires a little bit more work kasi you do have to cross-reference. Okay, even if it says in this section that it is in general unlawful, then you have to go back into the other sections. At least in the area, the section that where there's some mention of controllable allowance, you have to cross-reference that to see if there's something there that allows it. And even then, as I said, it's controllable allowance. There's some qualifiers. Just because it's there doesn't mean that in general it's no longer unlawful. Okay, you have to read what it says there about how it can be lawful as an exception, because in general it's unlawful. Okay. Now, to help make better sense of this, it might be a good idea to probe a little deeper, to look at least a couple of the penal provisions, the acts or the provisions that criminalizes a particular act, and analyzing each one of them, much the same way we did the other laws. And we're also going to, in this instance, we're also going to use the worksheet that I came up with. All right. So why don't we start with the first two items on the list, starting with the one immediately after the first sentence. Let me read it. Unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this act, it shall be unlawful for any person to, one, willfully and knowingly exploit wildlife resources in their habitats, or two, undertake the following act. So we're going to look at one first. Okay, so let's do that. All right. So basically, that sentence in a way already provides the elements, or at least the elements are there for us to retrieve. The first question, of course, if you recall, there's three questions that we're looking to answer. The first one is who did it? Who is the offender? Okay, and we can find it here. The next question, of course, is what is the act of that person? And if that act is not a crime yet, then the third question comes into play, and the question there is what would make that act a crime? All right, so those are the three questions. And here I think we could already gather the answers that we need to conclude on the elements of this offense. So for this first circumstance, we can already see that the offender is any person, okay, and that his act or omission is that of willfully and knowingly exploiting wildlife resources and their habitats. The question, of course, is there a qualifier? Well, we already said that as a general rule, that's a crime, right? So technically there is no qualifier. However, okay, the law specifically did say that there is an exception. So it would make sense as an investigator to put that exception that, generally it's a crime, okay, but there is an exception. If there were no exceptions, it's a crime. That's really it. But because it's explicitly stated on the law that unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this act, that would be the only time that in general this would be a crime. Okay, so there is that exception. So being that that's the case, we should include that as a qualifier. Okay, so the elements are that the offender is any person, the act is willfully and knowingly exploiting wildlife resources and their habitats, and the qualifier is that unless it's otherwise allowed in accordance with this act. Okay, so let's move on. Let's take a look at the next circumstance. And it reads like this: unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this act, it shall be unlawful for any person to undertake the following acts. Okay, so to finish this sentence, there are a number of particular acts that are enumerated. We're just going to pick a couple of them. Let's pick, I think I picked Yes, I picked B here. Okay, which is inflicting injury which cripples and or impairs the reproductive system of wildlife species. Okay, so now if we're to go ahead and pull up our worksheet, okay, again, we know who the offender is. It's universal, at least in all of these provisions, criminal provisions of this law. It really all refers to any person, and we're seeing that the offender obviously is any person. Now the next question is, what was his act? What was his act or commission or omission rather? Okay, and the act or omission is that he took or this person who undertook to inflict injury which cripples and or impairs the reproductive system of wildlife species. So the act is the undertaking to inflict the injury, okay, which results in the crippling or impairing of the reproductive system of the wildlife species. So that's pretty nasty stuff. Okay, so anyway, that's the act, and naturally there's that question of, is there a qualifier? And similar to the first instance, because the question, or at least the beginning of the sentence, refers to the exception, then it would probably make sense to include that as a qualifier, okay, unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this act. Let's move on. Let's take a look at another criminal act. Letter D. Now this is an interesting one, because you might recall when I was enumerating the provisions of this law that allows for, or that provides for, controllable allowances of particular activities. This was in the list, this activity of introducing, reintroducing, or restocking of wildlife resources. So being that that's the case, there will be need. Although this entire provision already provides, okay, because it says unless otherwise allowed in accordance with this act, right? But syempre, you're a good investigator, so you're gonna want to get specifics, and what you're gonna want to do then is to cross-reference this with the provisions, with the specifics that's provided in the controllable allowances that I mentioned earlier. Specifically, the one that refers to introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of wildlife resources. So that said, let's go ahead and pull that up. Okay, it so happens that's in section 12 of the law, and it again refers to specifically to the introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of wildlife resources. It proceeds with the introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of endemic and indigenous wildlife shall be allowed only for population enhancement or recovery purposes, subject to prior clearance from the Secretary, and the SENR, who is being referred to be the Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or the authorized representative pursuant to Section 6 of this Act. Okay, so there you have it. It basically provides for that controlled allowance. It would only be allowed, okay, and the way it's phrased here is it's attempting to control the allowance. Okay, it would only be allowed in cases of population enhancement, only for population enhancement and recovery purposes. Okay, and even then, it's still subject to the prior clearance of the Secretary of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Okay, so that being said, if we were to put this in your worksheet, it would look something like this. Okay, you already know who the offender is. That's any person. The act or omission is that person undertakes to introduce, reintroduce, or restock wildlife resources. And the qualifier, in order for this to be an actual crime, okay, is that it must not be among the allowances provided in Section 12. Okay, so if there is an act committed by a person, and this act being the introduction, reintroduction, or restocking of wildlife resources, and such act did not comply with the allowable or what's being allowed under Section 12 of popular enhancement or recovery. Okay, if it doesn't comply with that, then it's a crime. Okay, so there you have it. The qualifier is unless otherwise in accordance with, since we know where specifically in the law I specified it here, so unless otherwise allowed in accordance with section 12 of this act. Okay, so that's three three examples of how to analyze, and specifically looking at the way they presented the provisions here. It's a little different from what we're accustomed to based on the two other laws that we did. So at least we got a chance to do this exercise on three of them. And like the earlier laws, I would recommend that you also do that yourself. We did three, and there's quite a number of them here. I can see at least, let's see, there's probably about 10 or 11. So we did three, so there's still quite a number of them that you could do some exercises on, in terms of analyzing them to come up with the elements. Okay, so there you have it. At this point, we are essentially done with lesson number 2. Okay, so we were able to do pretty much what we were aiming for. We talked about the rationale behind the law of this Wildlife Conservation Act, that of excuse me, basically providing for conservation and protection for wildlife resources and their habitats. Okay, and we also got a chance to discuss some of the provisions in this law that provide some organization of how to deliver on those goals, being able to provide. Okay, so we covered quite a number of that, and we also discovered that in discussing some of the provisions there, that a good percent or a good number of those provisions play into whether the crimes that are defined in the penal provisions are indeed crimes. So there's that need to cross-reference. Okay, so we discovered that, and then of course we focused in on the legal acts, the penal provisions, and it's presented a little differently from what we've done in two other laws. There is also that extra need to cross-reference the other sections of the law, so we got a chance to exercise a little bit about that. And in any case, I hope that all made sense to you, and that it was helpful in allowing you to at least come up with perhaps your own techniques on how to analyze and determine the elements of crimes. Okay, so that being said, we're done with lesson 2. Until the next lesson, talk to you later.